Hi guys, this is a review video on Neuro for the Cerebellum, lecture 65, and then this is also lab 8 content. I think this might be the longest lecture we've had. It's pretty brutal, so we're going to do our best. I hope you guys are doing well, and we'll just get through it. So we're talking about cerebellum, of course, and where is it located? Posterior cranial fossa, deep to this little piece. And then inferior to the cerebellum, right around here, is this foramen magnum, and we'll talk about how if there's pressure here, then part of the cerebellum can go through the foramen magnum, which is very dangerous. And then we have sort of a description of the cerebellum anatomy. And so here on the cerebral cortex, we're familiar with the ridges being called gyri. On the cerebellum, our ridges are called folia. And so the cerebellar cortex, right, the cortex here, is made up of 3 tissue layers arranged in parallel ridges, and they just happen to be called folia. All right, so then we know, of course, that the cerebellum is attached to the brainstem, and we have 3 peduncles that connect the brainstem to the cerebellum, and we'll talk about each of them today. But the one that is, there are 2 that are incoming from the spinal cord to the cerebellum. The first is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, which is located here and includes 4. And this one is just, again, incoming connection to the cerebellum from the brainstem, and you can see right between medulla and the pons. And then we have the juxtarestiform body, which is part of this inferior cerebellar peduncle. It's labeled 4 right here. The juxtarestiform body we're familiar with from previous lectures is the connection between the vestibular and nuclear complex. Remember, the vestibular system is all about, move your head back and forth, what's going on with balance. Then we have the middle cerebellar peduncle, which is MCP. You can see that right here. And then, again, this one is an incoming connection to the cerebellum, and it's mostly contralateral pontine nuclei, which we'll talk about when we talk about the connection between the cerebral cortex and the cerebellum. And then finally, we have the outgoing peduncle, and this is the superior cerebellar peduncle, and again, this is just the outgoing one. So 2 incoming to the cerebellum and 1 outgoing. All right, so what does that look like in sort of a dissected cerebellum? So this region right here that we're staring at would be the part adjacent to the brainstem, and this region right here are the peduncles. And so we have the inferior peduncle, we have the middle peduncle, and then we have the superior outgoing peduncle. And then part of this guy would be the juxtarestiform body. Okay, and then next thing we had was the lobes of the cerebellum. So I think it's easiest to see in this particular diagram, but we have the anterior lobe right here, and this is made up of different regions that we'll discuss in a second, but the vermis and the paravermis regions. The posterior lobe is also going to contain vermis and paravermis, but right here is the posterior lobe. The anterior and posterior lobe are connected by this fissure right here, and this is the primary fissure of the cerebellum. The posterior lobe contains 3 regions: vermis, paravermis, and then lateral hemispheres. Again, we'll talk more about this in just a second. Then we have our final lobe, which we're familiar with from the vestibular system, but this is the floccular nodular lobe, and it is separated from the posterior lobe by the posterior lateral fissure. Okay, so here's an attempt, this diagram right here is an attempt to show all the lobes. We have the flocculo-nodular lobe, and these are actually connected to each other, but you can't see it because you have this, you have your peduncles in the way, right? So floccular-nodular lobe connected. Then we have the tiny anterior lobe, and then we have the large posterior lobe. All right, I still find these cross sections to not be the best way of looking at this, so let's just take a look at software really quickly so we can take a look at the cerebellum. All right, so this is our cerebellum. I've removed the cerebrum, but right here you can see this is our anterior lobe, right? It's not particularly big. Then we have our friend the posterior lobe right there. In between we have the vermis. Again, that's a region, and you're like, well, notice how it's extending into the anterior lobe, and it would technically be part of the posterior lobe as well. So it's just a region, it's part of anterior, posterior. And then we have the peduncles right here. So middle, inferior, and superior peduncles. Again, juxtarestiform body is part of inferior peduncle. And then here we have the flocculus, and if we were to continue in, we would see the nodulus connected to it. All right, so that's about it. And yeah, it's not too bad. Anterior lobe, posterior lobe is much bigger. And then we haven't talked about it yet, but we have the tonsils. And the tonsils of the cerebellum are the part that can go through the foramen magnum, and again, we'll see that in just a second. All right, so we got our anterior lobe, posterior lobe, and flocculonodular lobe. All right, moving on. So we have, of the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe, we've mentioned that we have the center region called the vermis. So the vermis is just a midline region of the cerebellum. Kind of looks like a worm. You can see this here. And again, this is part of the anterior and posterior lobes. Then we have the paravermis, para just meaning beside, and this is a region of the cerebellum that is located right here. Right, paravermis, adjacent to the vermis. Then we have the lateral hemispheres. The lateral hemispheres make up just large lateral extensions of the cerebral cortex. The posterior lobe is mostly lateral hemisphere. And then, just to be aware that the flocculonodular lobe are not part of they are not made up of vermis, paravermis, lateral hemisphere, because those are regions of the anterior and posterior lobes. Okay, so you have flocculonodular lobe. All right, and then finally you have the cerebral tonsils on these sides, and you can see that they're made up of paravermis and paravermis of the posterior lobe. And then tonsillar herniation is where this tonsil right here gets pushed through the foramen magnum, which again is right here. Right, that would be a very bad thing, dangerous. I think fatal is the conclusion. All right, so then talking a tiny bit about the white matter, deep to the cerebellar cortex, of course, it's made up of our axons, right? And so it looks like a nice branching pattern. So it is called the arbor vitae, like the tree of life. And then deep to that, embedded within the white matter, are 4 deep cerebellar nuclei, and these are really going to be the targets of the cerebellar pathway that we talk about today. They're the efferent motor. They're the efferent neurons for the incoming signals to the cerebellum. Will go to the cortex, then they'll go to these neurons, and then these neurons will send axons out to the brainstem. All right, but there's 4 of them. We're familiar with the first from the vestibular system. This is the fastigal nucleus. Then you have globose, emboliform, and the dentate. And the way you remember this from medial to lateral is funny gorillas eat donuts. So fastigal right here, gorillas, globose, then emboliform, and the one that's all squiggly and weird is our dentate nucleus. All right, so again, funny gorillas eat donuts, fastigal, globose, emboliform, and then dentate. All right, so not too bad. Let's see it one more time. Funny gorillas eat donuts, fastigal, globose, emboliform, dentate. All right, not too bad. All right, so we've got regional organization. We had the vermis, paravermis, lateral hemispheres of the anterior and posterior lobes. Then we have the flocculonodulus lobe. We have, in terms of lobes itself, anterior, posterior lobes, and flocculonodular lobe. Signals get into the cerebellum via the middle cerebellar peduncle and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. For the vestibular system in particular, they go through the juxtarestiform body, which is part of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. All right, so not too bad. What about the functional organization? So what are these pathways we're going to be looking at today? So the nice thing is they all follow kind of a similar pattern, which is you have an afferent, an input signal to the cerebellum. It's going to go through the middle cerebellar peduncle or the inferior cerebellar peduncle. It's going to go into the cerebellum, and it's going to end at the cortex, or it will go directly to the cerebellar nuclei, the deep cerebellar nuclei, which are our funny gorillas eat donuts. And if it goes to the cortex first, it's going to synapse on these things called Purkinje processor cells, which is this little tree here. And then the Purkinje processor cells are going to connect to the deep cerebellar nuclei. All right, so in afferent, this is just the general plan for all of these pathways to the cerebellum. Comes into the cerebellum, then it goes to the cerebellar cortex, to Purkinje processor cells. From the cerebellar cortex, it's going to go to the deep cerebellar nuclei, and then from the deep cerebellar nuclei, it's going to use SCP, superior cerebellar peduncle, to get out of there. In terms of where in the cerebellar cortex it goes, you're going to go to different places. We said, what are the different regions? Remember, we have vermis, paravermis, lateral hemisphere. You could also go to flocculonodular lobe, and this really depends on the information type. So we're most familiar with the vestibular system. So balance input is going to go to the flocculonodular region of the cerebral cortex. Spinal input, that we'll talk about today with the spino-cerebellum pathway, right, from the spine to the cerebellum, is going to go to the vermis and paravermis. And then cerebral pathway, right, cerebro-cerebellum, we actually have 2, the ponto and the cerebellum pathway. Those are going to go to the lateral hemispheres. I can't pronounce things, sorry. All right, then we have, so the input signals, they get to this cerebellar cortex. Again, that's going to be one of these regions. And they're going to contain, the cortex, which is gray matter, and then below that, white matter. Purkinje processing cells are going to be located there. They're going to take in the afferent signals, and they're going to send it to our funny gorillas eat donuts, or deep cerebellar nuclei. That said, this diagram right here should actually include something like this. You have also a direct pathway to these deep cerebellar nuclei, which we'll see later. All right, so then you get to the deep cerebellar nuclei after the cortex, and they are efferent nuclei, meaning their neurons are going to send their axons out via the superior cerebellar peduncle to the brain. Okay. All right. So then organization is kind of nice in the sense that we can sort of like map this guy out a tiny bit. Starting with, again, the one that we're most familiar with, vestibulocerebellum system, right? That's going to be the flocculo and the nodular lobe. And so then it's going to go from that to the fastigial nuclei, right? Funny. Then we have spinocerebellum is going to be all about unconscious proprioception, and that's going to be afferents from the spinal cord. And then you have deep cerebellar nuclei that are involved here, which are gorillas eat. And then this is going to be vermis and paravermis. And then you have cerebrocerebellum, which is going to be our lateral hemispheres that they project to, and then they're going to plan to send information to the dentate nucleus. But this is going to be, refinement of movement, aka coordination, planning, sequencing. Spinocerebellum is all about unconscious proprioception, and then we know vestibulocerebellum is about balance. All right, so that's the overview. We're going to be getting details on our, general mechanism, general pathway for each of these three different sort of functions of the cerebellum: balance, unconscious proprioception, coordination of movement. All right, so then the first one is our friends, the vestibulocerebellum. So this is the balance one that we're familiar with. Again, functionally, it's like this region, flocculonodular lobe, and the fastigial deep nuclei. Again, it's getting into this into the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and specifically the juxtarestiform body. What is the function of the vestibulocerebellum? It's to maintain balance and equilibrium, trunk posture, head and eye movements, and then facilitate the lower extremity extensors. But you think balance overall. The first order nuclei are going to be in our vestibular nerve, coming off of the ear region. You have a vestibular ganglia, and the vestibular nerve is going to come off of that. That's going to send its axons to one of two places, one to the vestibular nuclei, and then the other place it can send to directly is through the juxtarestiform body, again, of the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and into the flocculonodular lobe, or directly to the fastigial deep cerebellar nuclei. All right, so then we would consider this guy right here, the ipsilateral vestibular nuclei, to be the second order relay station. And then, as we said, this information is going through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, the juxtarestiform body, to its cortex target, which is the flocculonodular lobe. And then from the flocculonodular, it's going to go to the deep cerebellar nucleus, or axons from either vestibular nuclei or vestibular nerve can go straight to the fastigial deep cerebellar nucleus. We said that these are efferent or output neurons, so they can send their information. The output is going to go bilateral to vestibular nuclei, and from there you have two different tracks from the vestibular nuclei, which we'll get to in just a second. All right, so then, here's just another diagram of this. I'll show this one in just a second, but this is what we were familiar with from exam 2, I believe. So we have, coming from the ear, we have the vestibular ganglion. That's going to come in. It's going to either go directly to the flocculonodular lobe, or it's going to go to the vestibular nuclei. And then from the vestibular nuclei, you're going to go to the flocculonodular lobe, or directly to the fastigial nucleus, which is located right here. And then from the fastigial nucleus, you're going to go bilateral to the vestibular nuclear complex. And then from the vestibular nuclear complex, you're going to send out a lateral vestibular spinal tract, and you're going to send out a bilateral medial vestibular spinal tract. Again, we'll talk about that more in just a second. But again, coming in from the ear to the vestibular ganglion, from there you can go directly to the floccular nodular lobe, or you can go to vestibular nuclear complex. You could also theoretically go straight to the fastigial nuclei, and then from the vestibular nuclei you can go to the vestibular cerebellum or to the fastigial nuclei. All right, so that's what we see here. this is the vestibular nuclear complex. It's going through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellum, and its first target is, it could go either to the vestigial directly, or it can go to, from here, go to the nodulus or the flocculus. Again, they're connected. We can't see because it's deep to this inferior cerebellar peduncle. And then from nodulus, if you went there first, then you go to vestigial, and we know vestigial is our output neuron, which can also do some processing. But remember, we have the Purkinje cells in the the cortex, which is doing primarily processing and then sending to the vestigial nucleus. From the vestigial nucleus, again, it's our output, so we go output bilaterally to our vestibular nuclei. Okay, so not too bad. We said our output is to vestibular spinal tract, and so we learned about this previously, but you have from our vestibular nuclei, you have this sort of longitude or lateral vestibular spinal tract, and then you have the medial vestigial spinal tract. And so here it's just showing it. I don't know why they didn't show it coming from the same side. That's a little annoying, but the lateral vestibular spinal tract is ipsilateral, and it's present at all spinal levels. It facilitates, again, this is lateral, facilitates lower extremity extensors. Again, this is for balance and postural muscles. It will synapse, right? So you're coming in lateral spinal tract, lateral vestibular spinal tract. You're going to synapse here in this ventral horn. So coming in like that, and then you synapse here, and then you go to the muscle itself. All right, and so that's what we see here with this alpha neuron. And then for the medial one, you have here medial vestigial spinal tract, and this is bilateral. This is for the cervical, right, neck and upper thoracic levels. All right, so it targets neck and upper extremity muscles in response to the linear and angular movements of the head. All right, so you have lateral for lower extremity and postural muscles, medial, which is bilateral, for upper neck, or for neck and upper extremity. All right, so here's just a little bit of practice, since we like to practice. So we have the vestibular nerve. Then we know that can go directly into the juxtaresciform body, which we know is part of the ICP. And then this guy, vestibular nerve, can also go to the vestibular nuclear complex. And we know that's the same thing here, vestibular nuclear complex. Okay, and then from there, we can project outwards. This is the juxtaresciform body that I'm highlighting right here. And that will go to the floccular nodular lobe. Specifically, what type of cells? They're going to be going to our Purkinje cells in the cortex of the cerebellum, our processing cells. And then from there, it can go to the fastigial nucleus. This is our funny part of the funny gorillas eat donuts. And then we know that this guy is an output nuclei, so it's going to send out output bilaterally back to the vestibular nuclear complex, like so. All right, and then our vestibular nuclear complex, right, this whole guy right here, is going to send out the lateral vestibular spinal tract and then the medial vestibular spinal tract. And so it should, I think that for illustration purposes in this diagram, it should look like this, right? So you have lateral and then bilateral. We know lateral is is lower extremity, medial is head and neck. All right, so you have lateral vestibular spinal tract, medial vestibular spinal tract for head and neck, and this is L, you could think lower extremity. All right, so LVST, MVST. All right, so not so bad. This diagram right here is what you really need to know, so we'll practice that again. All right, so our first pathway is vestibulocerebellum. We still have spinal, from spinal cord to cerebellum. Here was ear to cerebellum, back to spinal cord. Here is spinal, so we need unconscious proprioception, and then we need from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. All right, so this is the spinal cerebellum. I apologize, guys. This is, like I said, the longest lecture I think we've ever had, which is really kind of frustrating that it was one lecture. So we have the spinal cerebellum. This is pathway number 2, and spino. So input from the spine. You're like, what comes in from the spine? Positioning comes in from the spine, right? So this is the purpose of this pathway is to process unconscious proprioception for the adjustment of muscle tone in response to muscle stretch and load, and it helps maintain posture and then limb musculature, but unconscious proprioception. And in particular, we have use of these Golgi tendon organs for measuring tension in muscle. And then we have muscle spindle, and this is going to measure sort of load. And so these guys are going to come in. This is sort of a spinal reflex that we would see. Say your muscle's been stretched, it's coming in, and it's like, okay, I'm going to synapse on our alpha motor neuron, and that's going to go directly back to the muscle itself to change, how much the muscle was contracted. But you'll also have that information basically ascend upwards. All right, and so we have unconscious proprioception, and let's talk about the information that we need. So this is the overall pathway that we have. We have an efferent input, and we have this unconscious proprioception coming in from the DSCT and then the CCT. DSCT is dorsal spinal cerebellar tract. CCT is cuneo-cerebellar tract. That's going to send up unconscious proprioception up through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the regions of the cortex we're familiar with, the vermis and paravermis, and then it could also go straight to the deep cerebellar nuclei, the globose and umbiliform nuclei, and then from the vermis you could go to the vermis and paravermis would send to axons 2, globose and umbiliform. Again, gorillas eat, and so from there, we know these guys are efferent, so they're going to send out information through the superior cerebellar peduncle, and that will go to the ventrolateral nuclei, the thalamus, the red nucleus, or the reticular formation overall. And there's actually one more, which is the vestibular nuclei it can also go to. All right, so incoming into this whole system to the cerebellum, we have this unconscious proprioception information, and so we would say that this comes via 2 different tracks. It's just based on, it's annoying that these have 2 different names because they really follow the same pattern, but let's just get right into it. So dorsal spinal cerebellar tract, that's this one. It's relaying unconscious proprioception from the muscle, spindle, and Golgi tendon organs. Again, that's this guy, Golgi tendon for tension, muscle, spindle, load, and it's coming from the lower limbs and trunk. All right, so DSCT, dorsal spinal cerebellar tract, is lower limbs and trunk, and that's going to be thoracic 2 down to sacral 5. And basically the pathway is you're going to have this information, it's sensory, right? So it's going to come in through our dorsal ganglion, then it's going to, the dorsal ganglion nerve is going to send its information up the fasciculus gracilis, and then from the fasciculus gracilis, once you have, we have the dorsal nucleus of Clark, which you guys may remember, that is not present throughout the entire spinal cord, so you're going to go up through this fasciculus gracilis until the dorsal nucleus of Clark is present, and then once you have the dorsal nucleus of Clark, you're going to go ahead and synapse there, and then the dorsal nucleus of Clark is going to send its axons up the dorsal spinocerebellar tract, and then that's going to go into the cerebellum via the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so yikes. We'll take a look at that more in just a second. That's seconds right now. Here we have the, again, unconscious proprioception information coming in. We have dorsal ganglion. It's going to come up its axon via the fasciculus gracilis. It's going to synapse on the nucleus, Clark's nucleus. Then Clark's nucleus is going to send its axon up the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract. That's this guy, all the way up until it gets to the inferior cerebellar peduncle into the cerebellum. Okay, so what if you are sensing unconscious proprioception from a place that has Clark's nucleus already at that level? Well, it's the exact same thing. So you send dorsal root ganglion into the spinal cord. So you're going through the fasciculus gracilis, and then through there you're going to synapse on the dorsal nucleus of Clark, and then after that, that's going to go up through the DSCT. Okay, so let's just take a look. Here's upper sacral spinal cord, right? So that's this region. You have your dorsal root ganglion. It's sending, it's got its dendrite to get the unconscious proprioception. It sends its axon up through the fasciculus gracilis, right? And then fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus gracilis, fasciculus gracilis. We're lower lumbar level. We still have more of these axons coming in, fasciculus gracilis, and hey, now we're in like the L1 region, and we start to have the dorsal nucleus of Clark present. And so fasciculus gracilis is coming up. Now that the dorsal nucleus of Clark is present, we're going to go ahead and synapse on the dorsal nucleus of Clark. And now that I've synapsed on the dorsal nucleus of Clark, that's going to send its axons, again, this unconscious proprioception, it's going to send its axon up the dorsal cerebellar spinal tract, which you see outlined here. And that's going to just go all the way up into the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And you see here we're passing caudal medulla, and then here we finally get mid-medulla, inferior cerebellar peduncle, so we can start to go into, and then the cerebellum. So again, this inferior cerebellar peduncle present throughout medulla. Here's rostral medulla, and then inferior cerebellar peduncle. Here we go, and we go straight to the paravermis region or the vermis region. Again, that's this, or we can go directly to the umbiliform or the globose deep cerebellar nuclei. All right, so that's the input. If you are for the lower limbs in the trunk, so T2, thoracic 2, right? Think spinal cage down, or think thoracic cage and down, right? And then but what if you're like T1 and neck? So right, the first thoracic vertebrae and neck. Then you would use the cuneo cerebellar tract. And so again, this is just upper limbs and neck, C2 down to C1. And this follows the exact same pattern, which is really nice. And the idea is you have your dorsal root ganglion that's going to come in, and you're like, hey, well, dorsal nucleus of Clark is gone. And so you're like, oh, shoot. So what do I do? Well, instead, all you do is you're going to dorsal root ganglion, you're going to send your axon up the fasciculus cuneatus, and you're going to go up until you get to something called the accessory cuneatus nucleus, ACN. And then once you are in ACN, you're going to go ahead and send your axon via the cuneo cerebellar tract. Okay, that's going to go into the inferior cerebellar peduncle, into the cerebellum. All right, so let's trace that out. Again, this is the region T1, right? The first rib cage, the first rib vertebrae, right? T1 is the start of the thoracic cage, and then neck, right? So T1 to C2. So if you're rib cage and down, you're dealing with dorsal spinal cerebellar tract. If you're rib cage T1 and up, your cuneo spinal cerebellar tract. All right, and so let's just take a look. We are lower thoracic here. Lower thoracic means you're going to have, lower thoracic cage is rib cage, right? So we need to be top of ribs, so T1 and above. So again, if you are T1 and above, your dorsal root ganglion is going to come in. You're like, oh no, there's no more Clark's nucleus, so I'm just going to go ahead and send up via the fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus cuneatus. All right, here we're passing T1, fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus cuneatus. All right, so here now we have, in the medulla, caudal medulla, we now have the accessory cuneate nucleus, right? Here we have our nice three amigos. And so we have the accessory cuneate nucleus. Then you're going to synapse there. Of course, the accessory cuneate nucleus is also in the medulla, so I'm just drawing the fasciculus cuneatus still. But once you have the accessory cuneate nucleus, you're going to go ahead and synapse. And then from there, you're going to send up via the CCT, the cuneo spinal cerebellar tract, which you can see is adjacent to the accessory cuneate nucleus. So you go here, and then you're in ICT, and then you go into inferior cerebellar peduncle. But here, we're just tracing up the axon through the ICP from the accessory cuneate nucleus. And then just like with the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract, you are going to go to the vermis, or you could go directly to the globus umbiliform. All right, so to the vermis and paravermis, to our Purkinje processors, or directly to globus or umbiliform. All right, and then of course we know if you do go directly to the cortex, vermis and paravermis, then you are going to send your information down to globus and umbiliform. Again, vermis, paravermis have our processing Purkinje cells, and then you're like, well, what if you go directly to these guys? Is there no processing that occurs? Well, these efferent nerves from globus and umbiliform can send out, can do some processing as well. But then once you get to globus and umbiliform, you're going to send out that information via the superior cerebellar peduncle, and you're going to go to our ventrolateral thalamus nuclei, the red nuclei, the reticular formation, or to the vestibulonuclei. All right, so let's talk about the efferent output now. Okay, actually, within the cerebellum, we already kind of talked about this, but whatever. So axons from the cuneo-cerebellar tract, CTT, or the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract, again, cuneo-cerebellar is neck, dorsal spinal cerebellar is below, and this is all unconscious proprioception information. It's going to go to the vermis and paravermis of the cerebellar cortex, and then from there, it's going to send its axons to the deep cerebellar nuclei, globus and umbiliform, and then from there, you're going to go to your efferent output, okay? So the efferent output, this part, we have our ventrolateral thalamus, red nucleus, vestibular nucleus, and reticular formation. And so here's like the same diagram we had before, but just like a little bit more detailed on the output side. Okay, so our output nuclei, or our targets, are the ventral lateral nuclei of the thalamus. And so this pathway right here, I'm going to use a nice purple. So this pathway right here, via the superior cerebellar peduncle, that's going to go up to the cerebral cortex, and then from the to the cerebral cortex, and then it's going to go to the corticospinal tract, which you may remember from last lab. or maybe it was 2 lives ago. That's voluntary muscle movement of the limbs. So that's going to go down, 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 cortical spinal tract. Okay, so this is the first target, the thalamus, and it's going to do voluntary muscle limb movement. All right, then you have second target is the red nucleus. So through the superior cerebellar peduncle to the red nucleus, this is going to give us the rubrospinal tract, which is located right here. It's going to go contralateral back to the original side of the afferents. Notice how these cortical spinal and rubrospinal are on the original side of the afferents, and rubrospinal is going to influence just motor neurons in the ventral horn, so like muscle tone, etc. But rubrospinal, and then vestibular nuclear complex is our next target. And we're familiar with balance, but this is going to get to the vestibular nuclear complex contralaterally, and then from there we know lateral L is lower, so lower limb, medial is head neck. All right, but in the ventral horn, motor neurons. And then final target is reticular formation, and this is going to give us the reticulospinal tract. And again, this is just influencing motor neurons in the ventral horn, but you have the lateral and medial reticulospinal tract, which we should learn about more in the next lab. All right, so then here's cross sections just showing this, right? We have our globose and umbiliform nuclei. They're going to send out axons via SCP, and they go to a variety of targets. So in the caudal pons, it's really just going to ascend via the SCP, but you also go to the vestibular nuclear complex or to the reticular formation, right? And then you go to reticulospinal or lateral or medial vestibulospinal tracts. From there, mid pons, again, SCP, you're just going to ascend upwards. And then here you have the SCP in the rostral pons is going to cross midline. So if you had a lesion here, that would be like having a lesion here. And the idea is that it's going to go into the tegmentum of the pons and desiccate, so just like split bilaterally. More caudal midbrain, so a little bit rostral to where we were just a second ago. SCPs, again, continuing bilaterally through the tegmentum of the midbrain, right, this whole region. And then further rostrally, we have rostral midbrain. You're going to get finally to the red nucleus, and then you can see that here. And you have some of these fibers are going to go basically just bypass the red nucleus, and they're going to go up to our ventrolateral thalamus. Okay, so yikes, that was kind of excessive and obnoxious, but let's just practice really quickly. So we have unconscious proprioception for the spinocerebellum, unconscious proprioception, and this is coming in via dorsal root ganglion. It's going to ascend via fasciculus gracilis until it gets to Clark's. Or if you're in the T1 through C2 region, the neck region, then you're going to do fasciculus cuneatus until you get to accessory cuneatus nucleus. Tracts carrying the second order neurons are going to be the dorsal spinal cerebellar tract, and then the cuneate CTT, cuneate cerebellar tract, CTT. I don't know why it's CTT and not CCT. That's kind of weird to me, but whatever. And then you go through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and then we're going to go to the vermis and the paravermis, and then the globiform and the globose and umbiliform. Then you're going to go through the SCP to our targets, the thalamus, specifically the ventrolateral thalamus. Midbrain target is our friend the red nucleus, which is going to give us our rubrospinal tract eventually. Thalamus, we know, is going to go to the cortex, and then from cortex, it's going to give us the cortical spinal tracts, which are voluntary motor movement. And then pons, medulla, we have vestibular nuclei, and then we have the reticular formation. Okay, so good thing to practice that diagram. We'll get more of it in just a second. And then here we get to our final two pathways. And at this point, we're all fried, but we're doing our best. This is just a long lecture. So we have so far talked about unconscious proprioception with spinocerebellum. We've talked about balance with information from the ear. And so, cerebellum's all about coordinating movement. So now we need to sequence movement, and we need to sort of refine movement, right? So sequencing and refining movement is what we're about right now. And so the idea is that, the cerebral cortex is going to influence the cerebellum by projecting directly or indirectly to two input centers, two afferent centers. And the first of those input centers is the pontine nucleus, and that gives us the cortico-pontine pathway, cortico-cortex of the cerebrum, and then pontine, just for pontine nucleus. This is going to be doing sequencing and planning. Then you have the inferior olivary complex pathway, and that's going to come via the red nucleus. And so you'll have the cortico-cortex to red nucleus pathway, So cortex, cerebral cortex to the red nucleus, and then from the red nucleus to the inferior olivary complex, you're going to have the rubro-olivary pathway. All right, so this is getting gnarly, but we have ponto cerebellum and ponto P for planning and sequencing movements, and then ovulo cerebellum. This is going to be refinement. Okay, so cerebral cortex to the pontine nucleus. The pathway you go through is the axons, we call those the cortical pontine. From there, again, this is the afferent side of things. Now we're going to go through the middle cerebellar peduncle. We're going to go to the lateral hemisphere, or directly to the deep cerebellar nuclei, in this case, the dentate. If you go to lateral hemisphere first, then you can go to dentate, and then out of dentate via the superior cerebellar peduncle to the ventrolateral thalamus nuclei or to the red nuclei. Okay, so ovulocerebellum is inferior ovulatory complex and to the cerebellum. So that's our afferent center, this inferior ovulatory complex. We go from cerebral cortex to the red nucleus. So our pathway is called cortex red nucleus, cortical rubro. From the red nucleus, you go to the inferior olivary complex. So we have rubro for red nucleus, and then olivary, and that would be the CTT. That is, do not like that. Bad letters, because that confuses us with the with this guy right here, the CCT. All right, okay, that's my bad actually. This should be CTT. I wrote CTT, and we talked about that. And yikes. Okay, that's my bad. Sorry. This is CCT. This we can call CTT. Apparently, that is not cool. All right, we're just gonna call it rubro-olivary. All right, from the inferior olivary complex, you go through the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellar cortex. From the cerebellar cortex to the deep cerebellar nuclei. In this case, we will find out it is in fact also the dentate. And then you're also going to go to the thalamus or to the red nuclei. So the nice thing is the targets are the same. The only difference between these two pathways are the afferent center that you go through. All right, so starting with the first one, we already kind of talked about this, but pontocerebellum, what is this function? Planning, sequencing, coordination. All right, all lobes of the cerebral cortex will send down its axons via the cortical pontine. And so here you can see cerebral peduncle, superior cerebral peduncle, not superior cerebellar peduncle. And then you can see we have pontine axons. So then you go to, that's this pathway right here, cortical pontine is the name of the pathway. And then you get to the pontine nuclei, which you can see here. And this appears to be pons region. And from there, you pons, tine nucleus, you go through the middle cerebellar peduncle to the lateral hemisphere, to the dentate nucleus, which we know is the squiggly guy, and then out via the superior cerebellar peduncle to the thalamus and the red nucleus. Okay, the motor tracts affected, we know if VL thalamus is going to go back up to the cortex, and then that's going to give us our cortical spinal pathway. And so cortical spinal tract projects contralaterally to the spinal cord to the original side of the proprioceptive signal, and then rubrospinal tract projects contralaterally to the original side of the unconscious proprioception signal. But in this case, we're starting with a signal from the cortex. All right, so here's just practice on that. We have cortex. The name of the tract is our cortico-pontine, because we know we're going to the pontine nucleus in our pons. Middle cerebellar peduncle, this is cortico-pontine tract. That's going to go to the lateral hemisphere, then to the dentate. We know our friend superior cerebellar peduncle, and then we're going to go to the thalamus and the red nucleus. All right, but the thalamus is our major target, contralateral thalamus. Right, here's our center line going contralaterally. All right, our other pathway is the ovulocerebellar. So we know we're going to the inferior olivary complex, from there to the cerebellum. So we're starting with our cerebral cortex through the cortical rubro pathway, because we're going to the red nucleus. From the red nucleus, inferior olivary. So here we see cortical rubrar axon from the cortex, red nucleus here in the midbrain, all the way down to, this is medulla region, inferior olivary nuclei. That's our friend right there. And then we ascend via the inferior cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellum. Notice how this is inferior cerebellar peduncle, because we had to go all the way down to the inferior olivary nuclei, versus over here we went to the pons. Okay, so we inferior cerebellar peduncle to the cerebellar cortex, from the cerebellar cortex to our dentate, from dentate to ventrolateral thalamus or to the red nucleus. All right, so here cortex, red nucleus. Then we have inferior olivary complex. Then we're going to go through inferior cerebellar peduncle. Then we're going to go to the lateral hemisphere, Purkinje cells. And then from there, we're going to go to the dentate, superior cerebellar, and then ventral lateral thalamus. And then we are going to go from cortex. So this is rubrocortex, or cortico-rubro. Cortico-rubro, I put that backwards, that's my bad. And then here we have rubro-olivary. All right, so not too bad. We have done all 4 pathways. Let's just take a look one more time. We had balance, vestibulo-cerebellum. We have unconscious proprioception with spinal cerebellum. We have pontine and ovulary, so pontine planning, olivary refinement of movement. All right, so here is just some practice. We're having kind of the answers on the left-hand side to cheat a tiny bit, but let's just run through vestibulo-cerebellum tract. So you have your vestibular nerve, which comes off vestibular ganglion, which gets its dendrites go into the ear for balance input. Then this can go directly to the juxtarestiform body, or through the juxtarestiform body, which is part of the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and then up to the flocculonodular lobe, and then it could go directly to the vestigial deep cerebellar nuclei. All right, and then you could also go from the vestibular nerve to the vestibular nuclear complex, and then from the deep cerebellar nuclei, the vestigial nuclei, you're going to output bilaterally to the vestibular nuclear complex, and from there you get the lateral vestibular spinal tract and the medial vestibulospinal tract, lateral L, lower limbs, medial neck, right? So LVST, MVST. All right, we need to be able to draw this out. All right, then we have our next one was unconscious proprioception, spinal cerebellar. We take in unconscious proprioception. Then we're like, hey, I'm going to go up via the fasciculus gracialis and the fasciculus cuneatus. So this is going to synapse. Fasciculus gracialis is going to go up until it gets to Clark's. Fasciculus, which again, this is chest and down, so T2 and down. And then you also have accessory cuneate nucleus, and that's going to be T1 and up, so neck. And then tracts carrying second order axons coming from Clark's or from accessory cuneate nucleus is going to be dorsal cerebellar spinal tract or cuneate cerebellar tract. Okay, pathway is ICP. This is going to go to vermis and paravermis, and then from there to globose and umbiliform, SCP, and then we know that we are going to go to ventral lateral thalamus. Midbrain target is going to be our red nuclei, and then vestibulonuclear complex or reticular formation. Okay, so not too bad. This one we just did, so I'm going to go ahead and skip this for time, but please practice it. Then we have covered all of the tracks. What happens when something goes wrong? So signs and symptoms of cerebellar lesions, right? We're dealing with planning, refinement of movement, balance, unconscious proprioception, so changes in muscle tone. Again, symptoms of cerebellar lesions: hypotonia, decreased muscle tone; changes in deep tendon reflexes. You're gonna have hyporeflexia, decreased deep tendon reflexes, and then this is the big one: changes in muscle coordination. And we have so many different definitions here. It is deeply concerning, but ataxia without coordination, so incoordination, muscle weakness to lower extremities, generally affecting gait, tendency to fall towards lesion side, dyssynergia, disturbance in muscle coordination, uncoordinated abrupt movements, dysmetria, inability to control distance, speed, and range of motion necessary to perform smooth coordinated movements. This is the past pointing, so the pointing test, they can't point in an object accurately or follow a moving object, so dysmetria. Can't control the distance or range of motion. Abnormal heel to shin test, so they can't take their ipsilateral leg and put it on their contralateral leg and move their heel down without it falling off. And then dysdiadokinesia is inability to perform rapidly alternating or rhythmic movements, so flipping your hand over, tapping your fingers one at a time against your thumb, they can't do. Rebound phenomenon is you remember when you're kids maybe and you say, stop hitting yourself. So this person is you pull back their arm, you let go, and they punch themselves in the face. So that's rebound phenomenon. They can't control the agonist and antagonist rapidly and accurately. Dysarthria, I just gave an example of it. Speech is garbled, maybe slow or staccato. Action, intention tremor. So tremor during movements, different from a resting tremor, so something like this. And then nystagmus we're familiar with weird eye movements. All right, so basically the fundamental concept for cerebellar damage, it's most severe when the deep cerebellar nuclei are affected or when the superior cerebellar peduncle are affected. Ideally, that should make some sense, right? Because this is our output from the cerebellum. Whereas if you were to damage part of the cortex, well, the deep cerebellar nuclei are not being affected. you can go directly to the deep cerebellar nuclei and bypass the cortex. So if the deep cerebellar nuclei, your funny girl is eating donuts, are affected, things are not good. Signs and symptoms are often ipsilateral to the side of lesion, but can be bilateral depending on the exact site of damage, and lesions proximal to the decussation, right, the splitting bilaterally across the midline of the brainstem, produce ipsilateral. So if you're on this side, cerebellar lesions. If you're distal, so you've already split, you produce contralateral lesion symptoms. And then if you're at the level, right, if you're right here, you're going to produce bilateral. So ipsilateral, contralateral. Hopefully that makes some sense. All right. Yeah. Then here's just some examples. Here we are on one side, and this is pons. So pons, we generally are going to be sort of lower down here, and it would appear that we are more here. This is like a little hard to tell, but this is rostral pons, and you have superior cerebellar peduncle affected, and this would be ipsilateral because you're proximal to the decussation of the SCP. Okay. Symptoms: ataxia, dysmetria, abnormal heel to shin, hyporeflexia, dysdiochokinesia, which again is you can't tap your fingers or flip your arms quickly, tremor, dyssynergia, hard time talking, eye movements weird. Here you're going to have bilateral cerebellar problems because you're having the split of the axons from the superior cerebral peduncle, or dissecting, decussating, going through there. So bilateral, this is caudal midbrain, and then rostral midbrain. You're past the decussation, so here's red nucleus, right, you're here. So you're going to have contralateral issues. All right, we're almost done. We have blood supply to talk about because, what would actually cause damage? It would be like thrombosis or thrombolism, right? So some sort of blockage. So you have the superior cerebellar artery, SCA. This is coming off of the basilar artery. You can see it here. This is doing most of the work of blood supply, but the entire superior surface of the cerebellum, which you can see here, most of the deep cerebellar nuclei, and then the rostral parts of the middle cerebellar peduncle, and all of the superior cerebellar peduncle. So superior cerebellar artery does exactly that, superior cerebellum, but then also deep cerebellar nuclei. All right, then you have the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and exactly that, anterior and inferior. From basilar, caudal parts of the middle cerebellar peduncle, caudal portions of the inferior cerebellar surface, so inferior, nice, anterior, just follow that. And then same thing, we have posterior inferior cerebellar artery. This is actually coming from the vertebral artery, and it's going to posterior lateral medulla, but then also the caudal medial regions of the inferior cerebellar surface. Okay, so superior cerebellar artery, anterior inferior cerebellar artery, or posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Those are our three targets for blockage. And so let's take a look. We have damage to the deep cerebellar nuclei, or SCP. We know that this is going to be AICA or SCA, superior cerebellar artery. So this one does most of it. And so this is damage here, and that would appear to be the dentate nucleus. And so cerebellar signs are similar for each, and that includes all of those. And they are going to affect ipsilateral to the side of the ischemic damage. Here we have damage to the inferior cerebellar peduncle as a result of posterior inferior cerebellar artery blockage. All right, so right here, this is mid-medulla. And mid-medulla, so you're pretty far down, so you think inferior cerebellar peduncle, ipsilateral issues. All right. Okay. Spinal cerebellar afferents and not the cerebroafferent pathways. So ipsilateral ataxia, nystagmus, problems with balance. Okay. All right. Lesions that produce contralateral symptoms. Produces contralateral cerebellar symptoms due to interruptions of cerebellar efferent fibers after they have dicussated. Similar to each. Okay, these are standard, and it's just bilateral. Here we know this is bilateral because of its location, right? Our SCP is crossing the midline. Here, theoretically, we've already crossed the midline, so this should be contralateral. I think I might have said bilateral. Sorry, this is contralateral. It's crossing the midline, just like on the last page. Here we have vestibulocerebellar damage, so we have damage to the flocculo. This is the nodulus. The flocculus is over here, but we know that they're continuous with each other. We're just being hidden by the inferior cerebellar peduncle that we see there. All right, effects are usually bilateral because of midline lesion affecting both sides, and truncal ataxia, wide gait, tendency to fall towards lesion side. Okay, anterior lobe syndrome, malnutrition associated with alcoholism affects the anterior lobe of the cerebellum. We can see that, and basically, it's going to cause a bilateral effect of the spinal cerebellar function, which we know is unconscious proprioception. So you're going to have issues with walking, so ataxia, and then a wide-based gait. All right, so that was it. I would say what to focus on is doing this, but then going back over these is important as well. But that was, I think, the longest lecture we've had, and it comes at the end of the year. But good job, guys, and keep at it. All right, bye.